The room was thick with tension, the kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident but by anticipation. All eyes were on Jim Jordan as the question landed with surgical precision. Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture or grandstand. Instead, she asked what should have been the easiest of legal questions, one so basic that any seasoned lawmaker, let alone the chairman of a committee, should have been able to answer in an instant. But Jordan froze. His mouth opened, then closed. He adjusted his tie, shuffled his papers, buying seconds that felt like hours. The cameras caught every flicker of discomfort, every darting glance, every desperate attempt to mask confusion with bravado. Crockett remained still, her gaze unwavering, the embodiment of calm authority. "Congressman," she repeated, each syllable deliberate, "can you provide the legal basis for your claim?" A pause. A stammer. Then the familiar tactic. Dodge the question. He launched into vague generalities, hoping speed would substitute for clarity. Yet with every word, the hollowness became clearer. His argument collapsed under its own weight, his deflection and admission without ever using the words. Viewers watching live felt the shift instantly. This wasn't just political theater. It was a courtroom drama unfolding in real time, one where the prosecutor knew exactly where to press and the defendant had no escape. Social feeds lit up within minutes. Did he really just blank on that? Jordan's squirming and Crockett hasn't even started yet. Inside the chamber, the silence grew louder. Jordan's allies stared at their phones, avoiding eye contact. Crockett allowed the moment to breathe, her restraint more devastating than any raised voice could have been. Her composure was the contrast that made his flustered stumbles all the more glaring. The hero and the villain had been cast without a scriptwriter's pen. One stood grounded in knowledge, experience, and dignity. The other, built on bluster and swagger, suddenly found the spotlight exposing weakness he could not control. And just as it seemed he might recover, Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, preparing her next move. The atmosphere shifted again. Anticipation charged the air like static before a storm. But that was just the beginning. What came next would leave Jordan's reputation in shambles. For those who tuned in expecting the usual noise of a congressional, hearing hours of talking points, interruptions, and sound bites destined to vanish into the abyss, this was not that day. What unfolded in that committee room wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the collision of two visions of democracy itself. On one side stood accountability, steady and deliberate, embodied by Jasmine Crockett. On the other stood obstruction, loud and unsteady, embodied by Jim Jordan. The stakes couldn't have been higher, though most in the audience only realized it after the fact. Crockett's simple question wasn't merely about legal definitions. It was about whether the rules of truth still mattered in a chamber increasingly defined by spectacle. The law, once a bedrock of congressional discourse, had been reduced, by some to a prop, wielded for sound bites rather than substance. Crockett refused to let that stand. Jordan's stumble represented more than personal embarrassment. It symbolized the fragility of a political movement built on noise rather than facts. Here was a man who prided himself on fiery interrogation, suddenly cornered by the very weapon he'd long used on others. And in that moment, the imbalance of power shifted. For progressives watching across the country, it was vindication. For those exhausted by evasions and half-truths, it was clarity. Outside the chamber, the internet was already buzzing. Clips of Jordan's fumbling response were clipped, captioned, and circulated at lightning speed. "Watch Crockett expose Jordan's ignorance," one viral post declared. Another read, "This is why they fear her." Millions of people who hadn't paid attention to the hearing itself suddenly found themselves replaying the 30-second exchange. The FOMO was real. If you hadn't seen it yet, you felt behind. Everyone was talking about it. But beneath the memes and trending hashtags lay something deeper. People weren't just laughing at Jordan's failure. They were rallying around Crockett's composure. In a political landscape dominated by shouting matches and grandstanding, her calm precision was almost radical. She didn't need to raise her voice to dismantle him. She didn't need to insult, to posture, or to gloat. She let the truth do the heavy lifting, and that truth landed like a hammer. This was why the moment mattered. It wasn't about scoring partisan points. It was about demonstrating that dignity and knowledge still had power in an age of chaos. For communities who had often been told to sit down or wait their turn, Crockett's unshakable presence was more than performance. It was representation. It was a reminder that brilliance and preparation could still silence bluster and arrogance. And Jordan? Every attempt he made to recover only deepened the hole. His fast-talking evasions, once tools of dominance, now looked like desperation. His usual allies, quick to leap in with jeers or applause, sat stone-faced. The silence of his supporters was itself a verdict. The drama had only begun. Crockett had cracked the facade, and the entire nation was watching to see if Jordan could withstand the pressure. But beneath the surface, one truth had already emerged. This was not just a congressional skirmish. It was a cultural showdown, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of that committee room. And as millions replayed the clip, laughing, cheering, and sharing their own takes, few realized that the real explosion, the moment that would define this hearing for years to come, hadn't even happened yet. Long before that hearing room fell silent under the weight of his failure, Jim Jordan had built a reputation on noise. For years, his political persona was crafted around combat, never concession. He was the man who shouted over witnesses, who turned hearings into theater, who wielded rapid-fire questions like a machine gun designed to overwhelm rather than illuminate. To his supporters, this was toughness. To his critics, it was bluster masking a lack of substance. Either way, it made him a household name. Jordan branded himself as the relentless inquisitor, the one unafraid to put adversaries on the spot. Time and again, cameras captured him leaning forward at the committee table, his voice rising above the din, his finger jabbing at witnesses as though volume equaled truth. He relished the role of political gladiator, turning hearings into brawls, and casting himself as the people's champion against the so-called elites. It was a performance that played well on partisan networks and earned him applause at rallies. But there was always a contradiction at the heart of Jim Jordan's style. For all his talk about accountability, he had an uncanny ability to sidestep it when the spotlight turned on him. When difficult questions about his own record arose, the clarity he demanded of others vanished. He would pivot, filibuster, or dismiss, never staying long enough on one point to be pinned down. To many, it seemed the warrior who prided himself. On interrogation had no tolerance for interrogation directed at himself. The controversies that trailed him were not few. Questions about his handling of past scandals, criticisms of his role in partisan investigations, accusations of ignoring uncomfortable truths. These shadows followed him into every chamber. Yet somehow, Jordan managed to escape unscathed, his volume and aggression serving as a shield. When pressed, he turned defense into offense, shifting focus onto others before his own vulnerability could be exposed. This pattern created the myth of Jim Jordan, the indomitable fighter, the congressman, who always had the last word. But myths are fragile things, built not on strength, but on perception, and perception can change in an instant. What made his downfall in that moment so striking was not just that he failed to answer a question, it was who failed. The man who built his brand on interrogation, who fashioned himself as the scourge of evasive witnesses, was suddenly the one fumbling for words. The very tool that elevated him, the power of the question, became the weapon that undid him. It was arrogance in part that set the stage. Jordan had become accustomed to dominating exchanges, to steamrolling opponents with speed and volume. He rarely faced challengers who could meet him with equal intensity while maintaining composure. He thrived in chaos because chaos was his element. But against someone trained in precision, someone who understood the discipline of law and the weight of silence, Jordan's tactics fell apart. And that arrogance had consequences. His confidence in spectacle blinded him to the fact that the public was growing weary of noise without substance. People wanted clarity. They wanted accountability. They wanted someone who didn't confuse shouting with strength. The hearing was more than another political skirmish. It was the reckoning of a persona built on hollow performance. Every pause, every stutter that escaped his lips that day revealed the fragility behind the facade. He wasn't the tireless warrior of truth, but a man unprepared when the same standards he demanded were applied to him. The contradictions of his career, loud but evasive, aggressive but insecure, were exposed in the starkest terms. And perhaps, most devastating of all, the cameras didn't miss a thing. Millions saw him falter, not because of a grand conspiracy or an orchestrated attack, but because of a simple, straightforward question that any serious legislator should have been able to answer. His brand of dominance crumbled under the weight of its own emptiness. The irony was almost poetic. After years of weaponizing hearings for spectacle, after building a career on cornering others, Jordan was finally cornered himself. And the public didn't just see a congressman fumbling, they saw the mask slip. They saw the emperor without his clothes, the interrogator who could not withstand interrogation. The stage was set. The myth had cracked, the arrogance exposed, the contradictions laid bare. But Jordan's collapse would not have been so complete without the presence of the one figure uniquely suited to challenge him. Someone who brought not only legal expertise, but unshakable composure. Someone whose very identity embodied the accountability he tried to avoid, and that's exactly where Jasmine Crockett came in. Before she became the woman who silenced a chamber with a single question, Jasmine Crockett's story had already been defined by battles, just not the kind fought for headlines. She was forged in the trenches of civil rights law, where victories were measured not in applause or airtime, but in the lives of ordinary people who needed someone to stand up when no one else would. Her name might be new to millions of Americans who only saw her in that viral clip, but for years she had been fighting battles the cameras ignored. Crockett began her journey not with wealth or privilege, but with grit. She worked her way into law not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. In communities overlooked and underfunded, where justice often arrived last, if at all, she saw firsthand what it meant to have the law stacked against you. Families evicted, workers exploited, young people charged harshly for mistakes their wealthier peers could walk away from. These were the faces that shaped her sense of purpose. For Crockett, the courtroom was not just a career path. It was a battlefield where dignity itself was always under siege. Her rise was not easy. Long nights of study, grueling cases that paid little but demanded everything, and the endless skepticism aimed at young black women in the legal field, these were the obstacles she carried with her. Yet instead of breaking under pressure, she turned resistance into resilience. Every dismissal, every underestimation, every backhanded remark that questioned her competence only sharpened her resolve. She learned to wield her mind like a blade, cutting through the noise with precision. That precision became her trademark. As a civil rights attorney, Crockett developed a reputation for asking the questions no one else dared, for digging into details that opponents hoped would stay buried. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but she was always the most prepared. Where others relied on sound and fury, she relied on facts and discipline. If Jordan was the hammer, Crockett was the scalpel. One swung wildly, hoping to break through, with force. The other cut clean, deliberate, and undeniable. Her path to Congress was a natural extension of this fight. For years, she had defended individuals, one case at a time. But systemic injustice requires more than individual victories. It requires lawmakers willing to confront it at the highest level. Running for office meant stepping into an arena filled with skeptics who doubted whether someone like her could play the game. But Crockett wasn't there to play. She was there to rewrite the rules. As a freshman member of Congress, she entered Washington without the usual insulation of seniority or establishment protection. What she did bring was something far more potent, the clarity of someone who had seen the system fail up close, and the courage of someone who refused to let it continue unchallenged. That authenticity resonated. She didn't need to manufacture a persona or chase headlines. Her very presence, sharp, unyielding, and dignified, was enough to unsettle those who relied on bluster to maintain control. And so, when the cameras caught her sitting across from Jim Jordan, she didn't look like a novice sparring with a veteran. She looked like exactly what she was, a trained attorney with years of practice dismantling arguments and exposing weakness. Her composure wasn't performance. It was muscle memory, built from years of standing firm in courtrooms where the stakes were higher than political theater. For viewers, Crockett's poise was instantly relatable. She represented the countless professionals who've been underestimated in meetings, the countless women of color who've had to prove their competence twice over, the countless ordinary citizens who've watched the powerful talk over the truth. Watching her sit still, watching her resist the bait of Jordan's chaos, was more than satisfying. It was personal validation. It was proof that dignity could still triumph over arrogance. Her story also revealed why she was the perfect foil for Jordan. He thrived on shouting matches, on turning hearings into chaos where clarity drowned. She thrived on clarity itself, turning chaos into silence that forced the truth to surface. He was arrogance wrapped in volume. She was dignity wrapped in discipline. When his confidence cracked, hers only hardened. When he stumbled, she sharpened her focus. This was not an accident of personalities. It was the inevitable clash of two archetypes. Jordan embodied the old politics of spectacle, where outrage was currency and noise was mistaken for strength. Crockett embodied the emerging politics of accountability, where calm preparation dismantled false bravado with surgical precision. And on that day, in that hearing, their paths collided. The hammer met the scalpel. The man who had built his entire career on interrogation suddenly found himself interrogated by someone immune to his tricks. And while he flailed, she stayed steady, ready to dissect his contradictions with the same methodical grace that had carried her through every courtroom, battle of her life. If Jordan thought he could shout his way out, he miscalculated. If he thought Crockett would be rattled, he underestimated her resilience. What he didn't realize until too late was that he wasn't just facing another political opponent. He was facing a woman who had spent her entire career preparing for moments exactly like this. And in that hearing, she was about to dissect him, piece by piece. The exchange began like so many others Jordan had commanded before, fast, aggressive, aimed to overwhelm. He leaned forward in his chair, papers in hand, voice already climbing as if volume might drown out vulnerability. But Crockett didn't flinch. She waited, patient, unbothered, her eyes locked on him with the steady focus of someone who knew exactly where this was headed. "Congressman," she said evenly, "I'll ask again, what is the specific statute you're relying on?" Her tone was surgical, each word crisp, trimmed of excess. It wasn't a question meant to invite rambling. It was a legal demand, precise and clear. Jordan shifted, his body language betraying the discomfort he tried to bury under bluster. He launched into a story about partisan overreach, accusations, hurled at faceless bureaucrats, a thicket of sound meant to camouflage the absence of substance. But Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes or raise her voice. She let the silence between his sentences expose the hollowness of his deflections. Every time he strayed from the question, she gently redirected, steady as a compass. "That's not what I asked." she replied, cool and unwavering. "The statute, Congressman." "Which one?" The room began to sense the imbalance. What once looked like Jordan commanding the floor now looked like him running from it. His words spilled faster, less controlled, less coherent. He interrupted her mid-sentence. Tried to bulldoze the rhythm, but she didn't take the bait. She leaned back slightly, pen poised over her notepad, her restraint amplifying the chaos of his interruptions. "Respectfully," she continued, calm as ever, "your role here isn't to make accusations. It's to provide answers. If there is a statute, name it." Jordan faltered, the air catching in his throat. A stammer, a pivot. He accused her of playing politics. But the accusation sounded weak, hollow, recycled. He was the one dodging, and everyone knew it. The hearing room, once loud with overlapping voices, fell into a kind of hushed awe. The man who had spent years mastering the art of the aggressive. Pivot was suddenly exposed, his tools failing one by one. Crockett pressed again. Her voice was measured, never rushed. "Congressman, I'll give you another chance. Can you cite the law?" Silence. It was only a few seconds, but on live television, a few seconds of silence is an eternity. The camera zoomed in, capturing his tight jaw, his restless eyes. Viewers watching from their living rooms could almost feel the tension rising, like the beat before a verdict is read. And then he tried again. Fast talking, a flurry of words. About overreach, about conspiracies, about injustice. But now it was transparent. The performance was unraveling. His hands moved too quickly, his voice pitched higher, his rhythm lost its practiced confidence. Each deflection only underscored the truth. He couldn't answer. Crockett let the moment breathe. She tilted her head slightly, almost as if she were a teacher waiting for a student to realize he hadn't studied for the test. No anger, no mockery, just an unshakable calm that radiated authority. And the silence did what her words alone couldn't. It forced everyone watching to recognize the emptiness of his argument. The tension in the chamber grew electric. Members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Staffers pretended to busy themselves with notes. Even Jordan's usual allies offered no lifeline. The imbalance was complete. One composed, methodical figure asking a straightforward question, and another unraveling under the weight of his own evasions. The drama had transformed from spectacle to revelation. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were witnessing the collapse of a persona in real time. The interrogator had become the interrogated. But Crockett wasn't finished. She hadn't delivered the blow that would echo far beyond those walls. She was still sharpening her scalpel, preparing the cut that would turn a tense exchange into a historic moment of reckoning. And the audience, both in the chamber and across the nation, leaned in, waiting. But the moment that sealed his fate was still to come. It began with a pause, not an accidental lull, but a silence loaded with intent. Jasmine Crockett sat forward, her gaze fixed, her pen resting on the table as if she were underlining the gravity of the moment without saying a word. The chamber, restless seconds before, seemed to lean in, and then she asked it. The question that would change the trajectory of the hearing and, for many, redefine how they saw the balance of power in that room. "Congressman Jordan," she said slowly, enunciating each syllable, "can you provide us with the specific legal statute that supports your claim?" The words were simple, but their weight was immense. Crockett hadn't crafted a rhetorical flourish. She didn't need one. This was the kind of question every lawyer knows can cut deeper than any speech. Precise, undeniable, inescapable. Jordan blinked. He shifted his papers. His voice cracked slightly as he began to speak, quickly, nervously, latching onto familiar talking points. "Well, you see, the issue here is that the Department of Justice has clearly been overstepping its authority. And everyone knows it. Crockett didn't move. She let him run, let him spin out a tapestry of vagueness, the words piling up like sand trying to cover a crack in the dam. And then, with a single sentence, she sliced through the noise. "Congressman," she interrupted, calm but firm. "That's not a statute. I asked for the law." The silence that followed was devastating. He opened his mouth again, but the chamber already sensed it. He didn't have an answer. He tried once more, talking about political motivations, about weaponization, about how the American people are fed up. His voice grew louder, but not stronger. The louder he spoke, the more transparent the emptiness became. Crockett's tone never wavered. "Respectfully, this is not about feelings, and it's not about opinion. This is about the law. You've made a legal claim. You were asked for the legal foundation. Please, name it," Jordan stuttered. He laughed nervously, looking toward his colleagues for backup that didn't come. He fumbled with his notes, searching for something, anything, that might resemble the answer Crockett was demanding. But there was nothing. His years of practiced bravado had not prepared him for a cross-examination this clean, this patient, this devastating. The room seemed to inhale collectively. Whispers rippled from the back rows. Staffers leaned toward one another, eyebrows raised. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every bead of sweat forming at his temple, every twitch of his jaw, every dart of his eyes. It was the face of a man caught not in a clash of ideology, but in the collapse of credibility. Crockett pressed again, this time even slower, as though she were teaching a class. "Sir, I'll give you another opportunity. What statute, what law supports your claim?" he sputtered. "Look, the issue here is not about some technical statute. It's about fairness. It's about accountability." Crockett tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to register on camera. The moment was surgical. She wasn't angry. She wasn't grandstanding. She was dismantling him with the power of discipline. And the contrast was undeniable. She looked like the attorney she had trained to be, while he looked like the defendant who had walked into the courtroom unprepared. Another beat of silence. This one heavier. Jordan's voice faltered into a kind of desperate laugh, the nervous tick of a man who realized too late that he had no escape route. "You know what I mean," he said, wagging a hand as if to wave away the absence of substance. "Everybody here knows what I mean." Crockett didn't flinch. "No, Congressman, we don't. The law doesn't work on implication. It works on text. Cite it." The chamber erupted, not in shouts, but in gasps, in muffled chuckles, in the kind of collective recognition that only comes when everyone realizes they are witnessing history. Phones buzzed. Tweets were already flying. Jordan can't name a single law. Crockett is tearing him apart. Clips of his stammer, paired with her calm delivery, hit social media in real time. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. Crockett checkmate. Jordan meltdown. Law over loudness. Jordan tried again, words tumbling faster now, his usual speed no longer commanding but frantic. He cited anecdotes, partisan grievances, sweeping generalities, but none of it was a statute, none of it was law. His arsenal was empty and everyone could see it. Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady as stone. "Congressman, if you cannot provide a statute, then your claim has no legal standing. Is that what you're admitting here today?" The sentence landed like a gavel. Jordan's mouth opened, but nothing coherent emerged. His hands fidgeted. His face reddened. He looked less like the interrogator he once styled himself as, and more like a student called on to answer a question he hadn't studied for. The whispers grew louder now, the atmosphere electric. The hammer had swung wildly and missed, the scalpel had cut clean and deep. Jordan, once the master of spectacle, was left exposed as spectacle itself. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her restraint was the victory. She gave him space to answer, space he couldn't fill. The silence itself became the weapon, more damning than any insult could ever be. And then came the final humiliation. Jordan, in a halting, broken voice, muttered something about needing to circle back and clarifying later. It was the ultimate concession, an admission that he had walked into the arena unarmed. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The look on his face was victory enough. His brand, built on dominance, collapsed under the weight of a question, so simple it required only honesty. The interrogator had been interrogated and lost. Crockett leaned back, composed, her pen tapping once against her notepad before she set it down. The hearing moved forward, but nothing would be the same. The narrative had already escaped the room, leaping into the bloodstream of the internet, where millions would replay the moment again and again, and while the room struggled to process what just happened, the internet was already on fire. The clip didn't just spread, it detonated. Within minutes of the exchange, phones buzzed across the country as the moment lit up timelines like fireworks. Hashtags exploded into existence. And Crockett checkmate, Jordan meltdown, slaw over loudness. The raw footage of Jordan's stammering silence, juxtaposed with Crockett's icy composure, became an instant meme factory. One edit looped his face of confusion with the caption, "When you forget to study for the test." Another split-screened Crockett with the word lawyer in bold gold letters, while Jordan's side simply read, loud. The internet was ruthless, but also reverent. Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram reels filled with short clips of Crockett's calm dismantling, each gathering millions of views. "This is why preparation matters," one viral tweet declared. "This is what accountability looks like," another said, paired with fire emojis. By the end of the day, compilations of Jordan's failed dodges set to dramatic music were racking up views in the tens of millions. Late-night hosts wasted no time. That evening, monologues across the networks took aim at Jordan's meltdown. One host quipped, "Jim Jordan was asked for a law today. Apparently he couldn't find one in his pocket, his papers, or anywhere in his entire career." Laughter roared. Another described Crockett as the professor who caught the kid cheating and then let him sweat it out in front of the entire class. The audience cheered, clapping not just for the joke, but for the collective recognition of what they had. All seen, but it wasn't just comedians or political junkies. Ordinary people, teachers, lawyers, immigrants, students, shared the clip with personal reflections. "As a law student, this gave me chills," wrote one. "Representation matters. Crockett showed us we do belong in those rooms," said another. For communities often overlooked, her victory wasn't just symbolic. It was deeply personal. By the following morning, traditional news outlets had joined the frenzy. Headlines blared across major sites. Crockett corners, Jordan in stunning. Hearing exchange. Silence speaks, Jordan stumbles, Crockett rises. The interrogator interrogated. Analysts dissected the exchange frame by frame, pointing out the strategic brilliance of Crockett's delivery. Her patience, her refusal to take the bait, her insistence on law over theatrics. What resonated most was the reversal of roles. For years, Jordan had built his brand on being the hammer, the one who pressed, prodded, and bulldozed through opponents with sheer aggression. But Crockett had proven that intellect, composure, and precision could cut deeper than bluster. The hearing had shifted from a political skirmish into a cultural parable, noise versus knowledge, arrogance versus accountability. And knowledge had won. In progressive circles, Crockett's name began trending not just as a congresswoman, but as a symbol. A reminder that representation in power doesn't just matter in theory, it changes the story when it plays out live, unfiltered for the world to see. The clip became rallying material, a shorthand for what happens when marginalized voices refuse to be drowned out. For many, Crockett embodied something larger than a single moment. She became a stand-in for dignity itself. Jordan, meanwhile, faced the kind of humiliation he had once gleefully inflicted on others. Commentators pointed out the irony. The man, who made his name by interrogating others, had crumbled under the simplest interrogation himself. Editorials described it as a political unmasking, a moment that revealed not just Jordan's weakness, but the fragility of an entire style of politics, loud, shallow, evasive, when confronted with truth. The ripple effect was undeniable. Fundraising emails circulated with Crockett's face. Grassroots organizations clipped her exchange as a teaching tool. Professors shared it in classrooms, parents showed it to their children. The symbolism had stretched beyond politics. This was about standing firm when bullies falter, about wielding truth like armor. And as the days passed, Crockett's stature grew. She was no longer just Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She had become a cultural touchstone, a proof point that accountability still had champions. For those who believed democracy was gasping under the weight of cynicism, her performance was oxygen. Yet even as memes and headlines piled up, one truth loomed larger than all the jokes, clips, and hashtags. Crockett hadn't just won a moment. She had reframed the battle. The humiliation of Jim Jordan was real and unforgettable, but her victory represented more than a single clash. She hadn't just won the battle, she defined the moral war. In the days that followed, Crockett herself spoke sparingly about the exchange. When asked about it, she never gloated, never reveled in Jordan's humiliation. Instead, she reframed it with the quiet authority of someone who understood the deeper weight of what had happened. "This was never about me," she told one interviewer. "It was about reminding people that facts matter, the law matters, and that arrogance crumbles when faced with truth." That framing was deliberate and powerful. It shifted the moment from a viral spectacle into a universal story. Crockett wasn't holding herself up as a star. She was holding up a principle that standing firm in dignity will always outlast the noise of bluster and bullying. To her, the confrontation wasn't a personal victory. It was proof that even in a chamber filled with shouting, one clear voice could break through. Audiences connected to that message in ways that transcended politics. Teachers showed the clip to students as a lesson in poise under pressure. Parents pointed to her calm as a model for standing up to bullies. Young professionals saw in her the strength to navigate rooms where they might feel outnumbered. For many, Crockett represented the antithesis of cynicism. A leader who didn't just talk about integrity, but lived it in real time with the cameras rolling. The lesson resonated far beyond Capitol Hill. It wasn't just about one congresswoman outmaneuvering one opponent. It was about the timeless truth that arrogance is fragile, while authenticity endures. Jordan's noise had evaporated the moment it was exposed. Crockett's calm clarity, on the other hand, lingered like an echo, replayed, remembered, reinterpreted as a moral parable for the times. And that was the genius of the moment. Crockett didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to humiliate to win. She let the law, the truth, and her composure do the work. That choice elevated the confrontation into something inspirational, something aspirational. It showed viewers that strength isn't always about who talks the loudest. Sometimes strength is about who listens, who waits, and who strikes with precision at exactly the right time. In doing so, Crockett became more than just a political figure. She became a role model. Especially for younger audiences hungry for authenticity, her performance was a signal that leadership could look different. It didn't have to be red-faced, shouting, or drenched in contempt. Leadership could be calm, sharp, dignified, and still deliver the knockout blow. The moral crescendo was clear. Truth is sturdier than spectacle. Arrogance fades, but dignity leaves a mark. Crockett embodied that lesson not with a slogan, but with her presence in that room. And that's why the clip spread, not just because people enjoyed watching Jordan stumble, but because they saw in her a piece of themselves, the hope that when pressed by arrogance, they too could stand tall, speak clearly, and refuse to back down. Her closing words in a later interview captured it best. "In the face of arrogance, truth will always outlast the noise." And with that, Crockett's exchange with Jordan was sealed in memory, not as a partisan clash, but as a universal reminder that in a world addicted to volume, clarity still carries the day. Jasmine Crockett didn't just question Jim Jordan, she dismantled him. What began as a simple legal inquiry ended as a full exposure of bluster without substance. In that hearing room, under the glare of the cameras, the man who built his career on aggression was left fumbling, while Crockett's composure carved through the chaos like a blade. And that is what this moment represents: accountability. In a time when shouting often drowns out truth, Crockett reminded the nation that facts still matter, that dignity can still triumph, and that standing firm is more powerful than any outburst. This wasn't only a clash between two members of Congress. It was a reminder of what leadership looks like when grounded in purpose. But here's the real question. What do we do with moments like these? Do we let them pass by as another headline in the flood of daily outrage? Or do we carry them forward, sharing, amplifying, and using them as proof that arrogance isn't invincible, and that truth, when spoken with clarity, still resonates? If you felt that spark of pride watching Crockett, hold her ground. If you saw in her a reflection of the kind of leadership you want more of, then don't just watch, be part of it. Subscribe, share this story, and add your voice to the chorus demanding accountability and dignity in our democracy. Because history doesn't just remember the big events. It remembers the moments of clarity that pierce through the noise. And this was one of those moments. History remembers moments like these, and today, you were part of it.